Rabbi Esther Lederman works at the Union for Reform Judaism, directing the Communities of Practice program. Previously, she was an assistant rabbi at Temple Micah. Before moving to Washington, D.C., she served as the Marshall T. Meyer Fellow at Congregation B'nai Jeshurun of Manhattan, a prestigious and competitive position in one of the United States' most dynamic synagogues. She was ordained in May 2008 from Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in New York City.
Hi, everybody. I'm Cameron Trimble, CEO of Convergence, and I am here with my friend and colleague, Rabbi Esther Lederman, who we connected maybe a year ago, maybe a little bit more than that. It feels like we've become fast friends, so it feels like we've known each other much longer. And it was such a dear moment for me, such a sort of precious encounter, because we were on a Zoom call with two of your other colleagues, and we spent a good hour, maybe even a little bit more, just riffing on congregational life and what's going on in the world, right? And it was just such a wonderful moment, maybe cathartic, that I feel like, we just found friends in the world and each other. So it's just been a real gift. So tell people about you and the work that you do so that they can also share in your awesomeness.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Rabbi Esther Lederman. I use she, her pronouns. So my work is at the Union for Reform Judaism, which is one of the largest, most diverse of Jewish movements in North America. And basically, in a nutshell, my job is to organize and agitate congregational leaders, from the laity to the professionals to the clergy, to think about how to take an adaptive leadership approach to congregational life and think about what changes are needed, what ideally transformative, in some cases disruptive changes are needed in our congregations, which are the primary delivery vehicle for Jewish life and experiences for millions of Jews in North America. So sort of taking that kind of approach to organizing people, with the theory being that I think we're stronger together, we're better together. I think it's partially why, meeting you is like a meeting of the minds, right? What does it mean to do this in a Jewish space? You're doing this in a different space, because we are better together, and we can be braver together than we are alone.
Yes.
A little bit of what I do.
Yeah. And so you were at the front line as, a lot of the people listening to this conversation, working with people as we're working or we're living through this global pandemic and the kind of radical disruption that happened. If you think about the shifts that probably were already taking place, but maybe got accelerated, and that you think matter, that we should hold on to, that are good shifts, that are generative shifts, what comes to mind as kind of pathways into a future of spirituality?
It's so interesting you mentioned the word shift, only because right before the pandemic hit, myself and my colleague Amy Eason wrote a piece that was published in December of 2019 of 5 shifts we think congregations should be taking. And I think now looking back, I'd add some. I think, one of the main shifts that I think has forced congregations' hands, but I think we were talking about this before, was how do we create human-centered experiences? How do we approach all religious life from the experience of the individual or the family at the end, rather than the institutional needs? Because I believe, frankly, the thriving of our congregations are going to be or let's put it this way, thriving of our congregations will not succeed if all we're doing is worrying about institutional survival, right? How can we shift our thinking to a place where we've put the human beings at the center of the equation? And so for like a classic example would be, how do we shift to thinking more about how to create a culture of belonging rather than one that's consumed with affiliation and membership? Right. The idea being that, people who feel a sense of belonging want to be part of something, right? They want to be part of your community. But if you've started from that place of there are all these barriers you have to get through in order to feel that sense of belonging, you sort of hurt yourself. So that is sort of one major shift in my opinion. I mean, I also think, listen, this idea of reimagining what our delivery vehicles are for Jewish life. And I really actually think the person who connected us, Casper Kyle and Angie Thurston and Reverend Sue Phillips, with helping me think about this years ago, which is that right now, I could argue that the congregation is a technology, right? We use the synagogue as a way to deliver experiences, wisdom, values, virtues, community, and it looks a particular way. And I think COVID came along and has disrupted us. Not in the way that I would have wanted to be disrupted, obviously, with all the other terrible consequences of COVID, but also disrupted us to sort of say, maybe we need to work differently. Maybe we need to deliver Jewish content differently, right? I think there was a shift to sort of this concept of being a multi-access congregation. What does it mean to have giving people different opportunities to access Jewish life, but not doing it in the same way, right? Like Friday night services, very much this idea of, look, we all come, we all do the same thing, and we all do it in the same time and place. Well, what if actually services are really a delivery vehicle for what Shabbat is meant to represent: rest, restoration, renewal. But for some of us, coming together in a room together and praying and singing is really restorative. For other people, it might be we want to get together in a park, right? And read a poetry together, right? As a way of restoring us. Or maybe some of us are going to, dance or do yoga, or maybe some of us just want to do this from the quiet of our home with our families, because the idea of leaving our house is really complicated, and connect online with like 5 other families. So this idea of really meeting people where they are and understanding that, like, it's, a Friday night worship service is not the sacred cow. Also, my Zoom does this thing where it sees my hand raise and then it does that.
That is hysterical. I mean, you're here.
Zoom might be listening to me. But this idea of, right, that the essence of Judaism is not the congregation, right? The essence of Judaism is the teaching, it's the relationship to the divine, it's the connection to our teachings and our Torah. And there are multiple ways to give people access to that. And right, if some people want to do it in person inside the building, great. But if like people want to watch your teachings on Instagram, why does that make it? That doesn't make it worse because it's on Instagram. You might be reaching more people that way. So I think those are some of the key shifts that I've been thinking about in this moment.
Yes. So one of the key themes that have come up in a lot of these conversations is this idea of belonging. And that, for all kinds of complicated and I'm sure at the time reasonable reasons, we institutionalized our religious spaces in service of maintaining that institution. And it turns out what got sacrificed in that, for some, not all, but was this sense of authenticity in the belonging. So you can show up and you can feel like you belong, but there's certain parameters around what's acceptable to talk about, what's not acceptable, who's really welcome, who's not really welcome. So there isn't this, so when I'm hearing people talk about belonging today, it's a different kind of belonging than we would have talked about 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, where there seems to be like this vulnerability in the belonging, or this authenticity in the belonging that is more, is safer for people, is more accessible for people. Is that what you mean when you said belonging? Is that what you're getting at?
I mean, when I think about belonging, I think of belonging is that sense of I'm seen, I'm known, I'm understood, I'm loved.
Yeah.
And part of where I'm pushing, it's interesting you use the word welcoming, because one of my colleagues, Rachel Hall, wrote a great piece on the difference between welcoming and belonging and she was talking about this actually through a DEI and racial equity lens. So part of when I push belonging and when I do get pushback, what I'm trying to say is, listen, I might be a Jew and therefore in a minority, but for the rest of the things that I represent in terms of my identities, I'm the majority culture. I'm white. I'm heterosexual. I'm married to a man. I'm cisgender. I'm upper class, right? So I'm going to find that sense of belonging in many spaces because I'm going to see myself represented back, but also I'm going to feel that sense of being seen and heard. My voice is something that is heard. And many of our congregations are made up of people like myself with those majority identities. And I think, in order to get to that place of belonging, we have to ask ourselves, what, for those of us in majority who sort of have majority identities, to what degree are we going to pull back, right? And understand that what felt like the norm for me didn't feel like the norm for someone else. So therefore, if we're going to create a multiracial, multi-gendered, multi-sexual orientation, multi-abled, multi-class community, Jewish community, then it's not about me in the majority saying, please come into my home. I welcome you into my home. This is what the home looks like, and these are the rules. I shouldn't have that kind of power, right? It's about, we're all in this together, and we have to figure out together what this community looks like. And your voice is just as valuable as mine. And so that's when I think about the belonging piece, I think about how can our Jewish experiences in our communities be places of belonging, in particular for people who haven't felt a sense of belonging, because it's been more of a welcome. You're welcome to come here, but you are still, even though I'm not using the term guest, I don't see you as a co-owner stakeholder. I still see you as a visitor, right? And I think that's, when you're challenging those power norms, that there are challenges there. There's going to be pushback, right? Or there is that sense of, why do I have to change in order for others to feel welcome, or for others to feel like they fit in? And, and all you have to do is sort of look at the world around you and go, well, if it was built to support these particular identities or these particular power pieces, then I think we do have to adjust. So anyway, so that's some of the where my thinking is. And to your point about vulnerability, that means we all have to be vulnerable, including the folks, who are, more like not used to feeling vulnerable, right? Like we're used to being in control.
Yes.
And getting to have things work out exactly the way they are. Well, it might not be that way. And actually there may be spiritual growth for you in this moment. There may be spiritual growth for all of us if we could all learn to be a little bit more vulnerable and recognize we actually need each other more than we don't need each other. But yes, that means, acknowledging all the ways we are not perfect.
Yes. We named this summit Courageous Faith. And in part because of what you're talking about, that there's a courage that's not the kind of, charge out into the world, beating your hands on your chest, courage that we've been taught is, historically what we're looking for in leadership. But instead, it might very well be that courageous faith means subverting power, or, approaching power more mindfully than we have, and maybe stepping in fully to that vulnerability in all of its implications. When I say the phrase courageous faith and you're thinking about the Jewish tradition, what comes to mind for you?
Wow, I love that, Cameron. Subverting power as an example of courageous faith. I love it because, by the way, I think it actually can apply to everyone. Like this idea of, no matter what station you are in life. I also, when I thought about, because I was thinking about this term, because I also, one of the words we use a lot about it at work is also bravery, right? And how bravery actually might look different, if you're a white person with certain economic power versus if you're a Black woman waking up every day. Bravery you might be both brave, but it's going to look different. or there are more obstacles potentially to overcome if you're coming from a marginalized community. I also think of courageous faith as not being afraid of to live according to the values that we teach. And I'm trying to think of a way to sort of contextualize that. This is one example I'm thinking of. I spend a lot of time talking to congregational leaders about growth and engagement. And I was sharing the example of how some congregations are experimenting with online membership, right? Like, investing in them as folks who are never going to show up physically into a building, but they still feel a sense of belonging to the community. And often it is offered at a lower price point than, let's say, a family who was joining in person, showing up for religious services, showing up for religious education. And I had a leader once say to me, well, if we offer that, isn't everyone going to choose that, the cheaper version, over something that's more expensive? And I think one of the things that pained me when I heard that was, I worried that there was so little faith in what that was currently being offered, right? Like, you don't have faith in your people, that you're awfully offering something really powerful to them, but you think they're going to go for the cheapest thing on the offer. And so I think, so for me, a lot of courageousness is also believing in yourself, and like, what we're doing is actually really powerful, even if it only reaches a certain number of folks, like knowing that there are things that are going to appeal to these folks and there are things that are going to appeal to these folks. And neither one is one is not better than the other, but like, have faith in what your purpose. And then I think the other piece, it would be, as somebody who has studied, the prophets of Isaiah and Micah, I also think courageous faith is sometimes saying the unpopular or doing the unpopular thing. And by the way, I think that ties in very nicely with this idea of subverting power, because nothing is unpopular as trying to subvert someone else's power. But being able to be brave in the world, there's a teaching, this idea that sometimes we have this concept of rebuke in the Jewish tradition, like that you're supposed to rebuke your friends and your family because you love them, because you want them to live up to the best that you can. And there's a whole debate about how much you should rebuke. Some who say you should rebuke 100 times till that person is changed, right? And there are some who say, if they'll listen, great. But if your words are never going to have any impact, then don't keep rebuking, because it just is going to lead to hardening of the heart for both of you. And then lastly, there's this idea of, and sometimes you have to do it because you need to teach your children what you stand for. And so sometimes you say things that may have no impact on the system, but you say it anyway. Even if, I don't know,
You stand in truth.
Exactly. And so I think that's courageous faith also.
Yes.
So those are some things.
One of the things that we have wondered about together, because we have played together in space of imagining the future of spirituality. But one of the gifts I think that Judaism grants to the rest of the religious or the spiritual space is a real appreciation for a diversity of rituals, ways that we can, practices that help us encounter the sacred, however we want to language that. It probably, correct me if I'm off base on this, but it's probably, unfortunately, the result of being a minority faith, and oppressed, often targeted faith, that historically these rituals have been based in home life, or have been, it's sort of a 7-day a week kind of thing. Whereas what I find in Christianity is oftentimes, like Sunday morning, you parade Jesus out for a show, but then that person's life needs a lot of rebuke, the rest of the time. But as we're thinking about rituals that make a difference, that going forward, we really should think about, we should hold on to, are there rituals that come to mind or that you're seeing that make a difference in people's lives that we should
in this moment?
Yeah.
I mean, yes. And and some of it's about like a return, right? So some of it's about like going back to the sources and going like, what is out there that can be used today. And then I think some of it's about like taking the essence of a tradition and using it in your own, or coming up with a new meaning. So like when I think about mikvah, so there's this concept of it's a very, very ancient tradition. You can go visit archaeological sites where they have these mikvah, these ritual baths, where traditionally women would immerse themselves, men would also immerse themselves, this idea of purification. There's been a lot of experimentation with mikvah for other purposes, right? Like going, after, a miscarriage, or going after a divorce. The reason why I'm bringing up mikvah is because I think in a moment of social isolation and pandemic quarantining, this idea of re-embodying yourself in your body is so important, I think, to a ritual practice that, and although there are mikvahs you can go visit, like attached often to congregations, the idea also is like just getting naked in a body of water. Right. So, and to me, just even thinking about mikvah as a ritual also then leads to the idea of like, well, what are some other immersive experiences one can do with one's body that allows you to reconnect your soul to the divine? Right. So, how can, like, on the one hand, you could go out and get naked or get into a body of water and connect with nature, or how could you turn a walk, right, in among trees or at night into a spiritual experience for you? Because mikvah is another example of, it's, although there is often historically an attendant who watches you, it's an individual experience, right, versus a communal experience. So I feel like there are sort of more people are exploring more embodied rituals as sort of we return to our bodies in our homes. And also this idea of trying to reimagine, what does it look like when we can't be together to remember someone who's died, right? Like it's typical to show up together for a York site, which is the 1-year anniversary, or to encounter somebody when they're sitting for the 7 days after a death. And people are playing with, part of it's a playing of like, oh, we now have this technology that allows us to connect to people and I can still be with you. And so the question is, how do we use this technology? But also just, I think, reimagining, what does it mean to be there for somebody when you can't physically be there? How do I ritualize this myself in this moment to be with somebody when they can't be?
I'm thinking about how important it will be as we're shaping future spiritual communities that people feel comfortable being creative around the rituals, that and recreating them or creating them anew. But I'm also struck in your description of how you immediately tied together the embodiments to nature, and that and I don't think, of course, that's not by accident, that there's this knowing that is, I hope, shared by more and more of us in the face of climate change, that our rebuke and repentance, the turning around, will have to be hand in hand with our restoration of nature, or our, coming back into right relationship with creation. Am I hearing that in what you're saying?
I don't know if that's, let me start with this. There's for sure an urgency around the climate issue amongst the Jewish people, amongst lots of clergy, amongst lots of Jews. I think my aspiration is how can we connect those who are, right, the social justice activists who are like doing this incredible work, right, and recognize that there is, and those of us who are like maybe more, not necessarily doing the social justice stuff, but are more in the ritual space, like less of a bifurcated experience of this, because I believe they are so deeply connected. I mean, I think modern society has created, even with all the advances and progress of technology, or like all the creations and inventions we have created, there has also become we've become isolated from ourselves too, right? That our body is over here, our mind is over here, and our hearts are somewhere else, but our body, mind, and soul are all connected. And I think that's part of also the connection to the land, right? Like that. And that's, forgive me for a moment. Like I'm thinking about this concept. So the word shalom or shalem, right, which means peace, also means a sense of wholeness, right? There's no word for perfection in the Hebrew language, right? Like from a biblical perspective, the closest we have is this concept of shalem, of peace, but peace really being that sense of like complete, right? And I think, so I'm going off, I'm really going off on a tangent here, but this idea of body, mind, and soul needs to be complete. In order to feel whole, we need a connection to our body, we need a connection to our soul, we need to feel healthy, not just in our bodies, but in our soul. And like, I just keep thinking about how much mental health has been a thing, right? And so that's a piece of it, but also deeply rooted to the land we live in. And what does care look like? And so recognizing that it's like, there needs to be a connection between sort of the outward external, like, let's end fossil fuels and, let's make sure we're doing the work we need on cars and emissions, but let's also, like, that's a religious thing too, connected, but also connected to our bodies and the land.
That was not a tangent. That was good theological work there. So thank you for that.
Which I don't get to do very often,
Yeah. See, this is why I love these. I love these conversations. Yeah. We just geek out, and it is, and geek out on things that I think matter.
Definitely.
So I think, again, what helped us find each other in the world at a deeper connection. Sorry, something just fell outside of my window. Was a shared longing for our religious institutions, which have shaped us and that we care about and we work with day in and day out, to navigate these days in such a way that they embody these values, this shalom, this way of being in the world that is more generative and more sustainable and ultimately in far greater service to each other, to ourselves, to creation, etc. It's a big jump, from where we are today as institutional leaders to where we sense we could be going. What's the advice that you're giving to your congregations right now on the most important thing they should be focused on? I mean, there's all the stuff of running an institution, but what's the thing they should be laser focused on?
I love this question. It's just interesting because I just finished, hopefully it'll be published soon, a piece about what are our assets. And the message is people. So that's my first answer. And partially I wrote it because I think the fear for me was congregations who were felt isolated away from their buildings. In their desire to go back to their buildings, we're going to start to retell a narrative about their greatest asset is their building, right? The gorgeous stained glass window, the gorgeous, architecture, famous architecture type space. And I love architecture. I love art, but that's not what our asset is. There are people. It's the talent. It's the lives. It's the souls. So that would be priority number one for me, right? Like, the places that became vaccine delivery systems, like that's a so holy place, right? Like the places that sort of just transformed themselves in a moment because that was the need of the moment. I find so inspiring and such the priority. And like our local JCC, Jewish Community Center in DC, when the kids started to get, they could get their vaccines when they started to make them available for five and up, right? They opened their parking lot and said, okay, we're going to be a vaccine clinic. Like, in what world, in their, like, that's not why a JCC got created, but who the hell cares, right? Like, it's delivering health for our people. So that's one. And the second thing that that was the gut to me was just a return to your why. And your why not being, so there's a Jewish building in a town called Springfield, right? Like, we don't exist so people can have a place to pray. We come together as a place to pray for higher goals. It's those higher goals, it's that higher purpose that I want people to return to. And then sometimes I feel like a broken record, because I've been saying this for at least 7 years.
Yeah.
But I don't think it ever gets old.
No.
Because
I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, if you're separated, if you don't have a clear sense of your why, you have no North Star.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about the scriptures that it's over hundreds of years, thousands of years. It's we need the temple. No, we need the wilderness. No, we want the temple. No, let's wander for a while. No, let's root. Let's institutionalize. No, we need to, be pushed to the boundaries again.
But it's the institutionalized, like in the story of the Jewish people, it was the institutionalized power that lost, right? The priesthood lost,
right?
The temple got destroyed.
Yes.
And the zealots who just thought, they couldn't live, died on the top of Masada, right? Like, it was the Pharisees, it was the rabbinic innovators who said, no, we have Torah.
Yeah.
And that's good enough. And we can now do something new with it. And then, after expulsions and crusades, I mean, like, in some ways, that goes back to that ritual question you asked about, like, without that adaptation, we wouldn't have survived as a people. Yeah. We were constantly being kicked out of homes.
Right.
So if your essence of who you are is based, and it gets complicated because obviously we believe in Israel as a land, right? Mm-hmm. That does have some sacredness attached to us because of its history of our people. But ultimately, like, throughout our wanderings, if we didn't have the Sabbath, if we didn't have the connection to God, if we didn't have the Hebrew language, we would be lost.
Yeah.
And there's a famous book that this is called The Jew and the Lotus, about a bunch of Jews who went to go visit the Dalai Lama in his exile, and said, like, how have you survived? Like, I want to know, because my people are in exile. And, a lot of it was just like, they'd had a long conversation about the Passover Seder, mm-hmm. right? Which is a home ritual, right? About telling a story, right? Like, that's what keeps us together, not the real estate.
Yes. And my wondering is if, in fact, for our own good, we aren't returning to some of that, if we aren't being freed from some of the heavy institutional burdens, so that we can, become wanderers of a new age.
I would like to think so. I think it goes back to this courageous faith question you're raising. Like, do we have the faith? Do we have the courage to ask the questions that are not being asked?
Yeah.
I just did an exercise with a group of leaders who, it's a very small group, 12 people, who wanted to spend some time thinking generatively, expansively about, what future community should look like. And it's both this tension between, like, we know in evolution that, we share 98% of our DNA with gorillas. So, like, evolution just teaches you that, like, you can still have that DNA, but it can look very different. So we did this exercise where we talked about what felt essential to Jewish community and what felt expendable. And it was this incredible exercise, because everything that was expendable was the institutional pieces. And everything that was essential was the purpose.
Yeah.
And I had to push a little bit. Like, at one point, it was very beautiful. Someone put kitchens felt essential. And I said, tell me what feels essential about a kitchen. And she explained that, being able to be in communion with one another and sharing food together.
Yeah.
And I said, so that's what's essential, not the kitchen, right? Like, you don't need a building with a kitchen to make that happen. One needs a place to make food, but there are a lot of ways to make food. Anyway, it was just this interesting moment of like, how do we separate the vessel from the value? Anyway, it was fascinating. I mean, what was expendable was, but and the essential was double what was expendable. I mean, like, the richness of what was essential was so amazing. But do you have the strength and the courage to say, okay, well, maybe we need a different vessel for it. Like, the vessel we had served its time and purpose.
Yes. It maybe in fact, it's an old technology.
Yes. There you go.
Yeah. I love it. Oh, I love being creative with you.
Me too.
Dreaming with you.
Yes.
If there was one word that you would recommend we all hold in us as we're thinking about the future of spirituality and all that we've just talked about, that it could be a guidepost for us or a inspiration for us, what's your one word?
Do I get a minute to think about it?
No, right now. Come on. Let's go.
Relationship.
Yeah. Okay.
Relationship.
Yes.
That's my one word.
It's a good word.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, it's all that is in relationship.
Right.
So,
And I think that there is, I was thinking mostly about, it's so complex, whether it's having this kind of relationship, the relationship I need with myself, the relationship I need with my tradition. Like, it's an anchor to me, that word, and what it stands for.
Yep. Thanks for geeking out with me.
My pleasure. I'll geek out with you anytime.
All right. Thank you.